bullet went through the drywall clean, close enough that Cleo Bancroft felt the displaced air brushed her cheek a half-second before she registered the sound. 7 years in County General's emergency department had given her a working familiarity with gunshot physics. She had packed wounds, called time of death, watched trauma surgeons work with the focused calm of men who had made peace with blood long ago. She had never been the one pressed against the wall, with the shooter on the other side. 40 minutes earlier, her biggest concern had been whether the shellfish allergy notation had made it from the event coordinator's clipboard to the actual kitchen. She had flagged it twice. The Drake Hotel's Lakeview ballroom on a Thursday evening smelled like fresh gardenias and older money, the specific combination that Cleo had come to associate with the private event circuit she worked to supplement her nursing income. The Meridian Children's Foundation Gala attracted the usual taxonomy of Chicago's elite. Aldermen with ambitious wives, tech executives who had discovered philanthropy, somewhere around their 4th tax bracket, and a small constellation of faces that Cleo recognized from the kind of news stories that didn't name sources. The room was luminous in the way that only truly expensive lighting could achieve, warm and forgiving, making everyone look slightly more distinguished than they were. She moved through the perimeter of the room in her capacity as the evening's on-call medical attendant, a laminated credential on a lanyard around her neck, a compact first aid kit in the bag over her shoulder, and the specific brand of invisible alertness she had developed working triage. Her job was to be unobtrusive until someone needed her, and then to be the calmest person in the immediate vicinity. She was good at it. She had been doing the same thing in different uniforms since she was 22. Cleo was good at watching people without appearing to. Which was how, 40 minutes before the bullet, she noticed Maxim Sorel. She recognized him the way anyone who worked to Chicago's institutional landscape eventually recognized him, not from introductions but from context. The very particular quality of space that formed around him. The 4 men positioned at the cardinal points of his booth, too still to be guests, too expensive to be ordinary staff. The booth itself, tucked into the venue's northeast corner with sightlines to every entrance and exit, occupied by a single man nursing a glass of something dark and undoubtedly old. Maxim Sorel ran the most sophisticated criminal syndicate operating between Detroit and Philadelphia. He did it, as far as Cleo understood, through a network of legitimate real estate holding companies that would have been genuinely impressive even if they hadn't also been laundering money on a scale most people couldn't conceptualize. He was 42 by the papers. He looked it in the way that powerful men often did, not old exactly, but seasoned in a way that had burned off everything soft long ago. He was also showing 3 distinct clinical indicators of hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Cleo clocked it from 20 feet away, and her stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the 6 months she had spent learning that specific constellation of signs by absolute necessity. The faint distension at his left jugular barely perceptible, the kind of thing a person could dismiss as posture or fatigue. The controlled quality of his breathing that wasn't quite relaxation, it was management. And his color, imperceptibly off beneath the warm lighting, the particular pallor of a cardiovascular system working harder than it should at rest. Her younger sister Dana had been diagnosed 14 months ago. Cleo had subsequently read everything published on the condition in the last decade. She would have recognized those indicators on a stranger across a dark parking lot. She stood very still for a moment, holding a glass of sparkling water she'd taken from a passing tray, just to have something to do with her hands, and ran the calculation. Maxim Sorel was not a man you approached. Every person in this room who recognized him was currently demonstrating that understanding by maintaining a comfortable, respectful distance. His guards had the flat, professional expressions of men who would create serious problems for anyone who disturbed that distance without an invitation. On the other hand, hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy killed its host suddenly and without warning, in approximately 30% of unmanaged cases. The heart's outflow tract thickened gradually, silently, until the muscle that was supposed to sustain life found itself working against its own architecture. It did not announce itself. It simply stopped. Cleo thought about Dana, about the surgery that would cost $68,000 that their insurance had classified as elective 3 separate times despite 2 appeals, that Cleo had been working double shifts and every private event contract she could secure since April, trying to cobble toward. She thought about what it felt like to know something was wrong with someone and say nothing. She set her glass down on the nearest cocktail table and walked toward the northeast corner. The first guard stepped into her path with the quiet efficiency of a man who did not need to be loud to be immovable. Cleo didn't slow down significantly, just enough to look up at him with the specific expression she used when a patient's family member was blocking a gurney in a hospital corridor. Not aggressive, not apologetic, simply the face of a person who needed to be exactly where she was going. "I'm the medical attendant for this event," she said, keeping her voice low and level. "The man in that booth is showing cardiovascular symptoms that I need to assess. I need 30 seconds of his time." The guard's eyes moved to her lanyard, to her bag, back to her face. He did not move. "The symptoms he's showing," Cleo continued, dropping her voice further so only he could hear, present, asymptomatically until they don't. Meaning the first sign most people get is the last one they get. "I need to speak to him." A second guard had materialized at her left. The room around them had not gone quiet. There was no dramatic silencing, no turning of heads, but Cleo was aware, in her peripheral vision, of a slight recalibration in the nearest cluster of guests. The small animal awareness that registers something unusual without understanding it. Then from the booth, a single word. "Enough." The voice was quiet. It carried anyway. Both guards stepped back with the synchronized ease of men who had been moving in response to that particular voice for a long time. Cleo walked the remaining 8 feet to the booth and stopped at its edge. Maxim Sorel looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who was rarely surprised and had developed over time a specific curiosity about the rare exceptions. His eyes were a dark, imprecise color in the low light, and they moved across her with a clinical efficiency that Cleo recognized because she used it herself, cataloging, assessing, filing. She was wearing her work clothes. Black slacks, a collared white shirt, flat shoes rated for 12-hour shifts on concrete floors. The laminated credential around her neck had her name and the event company logo in 12-point font. She was not, by any measurable standard, a person who belonged in Maxim Sorel's immediate vicinity. She held his gaze anyway. "Mr. Sorel," she said, "my name is Cleo Bancroft. I'm the on-call medical attendant tonight. I noticed something from across the room that I'd like to discuss with you privately, if you'll allow it." "You walked past 8 people in this room with more obvious reasons to require a medic," Maxim said. His voice was low even, with the faintest cadence of someone who had spent time in more than one country. "You came directly here." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you're the only one in this room who might actually need me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and both guards moved to a distance that allowed conversation without abandoning their posts. Maxim shifted slightly in his seat, the movement of a man making space without making it obvious, and Cleo stepped into the booth's edge close enough to speak without being overheard. She kept her voice professional. She explained what she had observed and what it indicated. She did not minimize it because she had learned the hard way that minimizing cardiac symptoms was how people died in hospital waiting rooms, thinking they had indigestion. She watched his face as she spoke and saw very briefly something shift behind his careful expression. Not fear exactly, but the particular acknowledgement of a man who was hearing something he had been quietly aware of for longer than he wanted to admit. "You're describing a diagnosis," he said when she finished, "based on 30 seconds of observation from across a room." "I'm describing a clinical picture that warrants evaluation," Cleo said. My sister has the same condition. I've spent 14 months learning everything there is to know about it. I know what it looks like." His gaze changed. It was subtle. A slight sharpening, a recalibration. "And what do you want?" The question was direct and unsentimental, and Cleo appreciated it. "Nothing from you specifically," she said. "My job tonight is the medical welfare of anyone in this building, yours included. I wanted you to know what I'm seeing so you can make an informed decision about your own care." She watched him process that, the idea that someone had approached him wanting nothing. She could see it was not a concept he encountered with any regularity. "Dana," he said, "your sister." Cleo blinked. She hadn't mentioned Dana's name. "You said you spent 14 months learning," he said. "That's not abstract interest. What does her treatment cost?" The directness of it should have felt intrusive. It didn't. 68,000, Cleo said. "The procedure that would fix it." He nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they're not agreeing with something so much as filing it. He was about to say something else when Cleo's eyes caught movement near the ballroom's East Service entrance, and everything in her that had spent 7 years in emergency medicine snapped to high alert before her conscious mind fully processed what she was seeing. The man by the door was wearing a white server's jacket. The jacket was correct. The shoes were not. Heavy-soled tactical boots where every other server in the room wore regulation black non-slip flats. And the earpiece he was adjusting was the wrong profile entirely, too thick. The specific form factor of military-grade encrypted communication, rather than the hotel's standard staff radio system. She had worked enough events to know the difference. "Get up," Cleo said. Her voice came out at the same low, even pitch she used when telling a patient they needed surgery. "Right now, we need to move." Maxim looked at her. "East Service door," she said. The man adjusting his ear. "Those aren't hotel shoes and that isn't hotel comm equipment. Move now or don't, but I'm telling you what I'm seeing." For exactly 1 second, nothing happened. Then Maxim Sorel stood up. The lights went out 3 heartbeats later. Not a power failure, a targeted cut, the ballroom and its immediate corridors dropping into darkness while the emergency strip lighting flickered on at floor level, casting everything in an anemic red glow. The screaming started a second after that, the specific pitch of a room full of people who had never experienced anything like this and had nowhere to file it. Cleo was already moving, her hand wrapped around Maxim's forearm because she could not see his face, and she needed him to stay with her. She heard the suppressed shots, a sound she knew from her ER rotations, the quiet, systematic thip-thip that was nothing like what Hollywood suggested, and she ran. She knew this hotel. Cleo Bancroft had worked 31 events at the Drake in 3 years. She knew where the freight elevator was, where the service corridor connected to the kitchen loading area, where the fire stairs came out on the building's west face away from the main entrance. This knowledge had been entirely unremarkable until this specific moment. She pulled Maxim through the kitchen access door before his guards had fully reoriented. Through the blinding fluorescent utility of the commercial kitchen, where the catering staff were either flattened against the stainless steel prep tables or sprinting for the exits through the corridor behind the pastry station, down the half-flight to the freight elevator landing. She hit the call button and felt his hand close around her arm in the dark, steadying rather than stopping her. "You know this building," he said. "I've catered every major event they've hosted since 2023, she said. "I needed the income." The elevator opened, they got in. Cleo pressed B2. The doors closed, and the sudden quiet was almost violent after the noise above them. Cleo leaned against the metal wall and breathed, deliberately and professionally, the way she breathed through the worst moments in the ER. Her hands were shaking. She catalogued that as a normal physiological response and set it aside. She looked at the man beside her. His suit jacket was pulled at the shoulder from where she'd grabbed him. There was a shallow cut along his jawline from something she hadn't seen happen. He was looking at her with the same undiluted attention he'd given her in the booth, only sharper now, the way a person looked at something they hadn't expected to need. "They came through the kitchen staff," Cleo said, because her mind was working the way it did in trauma situations. Processing, ordering, speaking the relevant findings aloud. "Not through the guest entrance, which means someone got them in. The biometric entry for event staff at this venue runs through the hotel's security contractor." "I know how the entry system works," Maxim said. "Then you know that you don't have an external problem," Cleo said. "Someone inside your operation has access to your schedule, your preferred seating position, and the vendor relationships for this event. Those three things together is a very small list of people." The elevator stopped. The doors opened to the parking structure's service level, the concrete grey and cold under the utility lights. A black Suburban sat near the exit ramp, engine idling. Maxim made a call on a secondary phone he'd produced from somewhere, brief, in a language he didn't speak, and redirected their destination before she'd registered what he was doing. The building he took her to was not what she had expected, which was something aggressively fortified and obvious. It was a tower on the near north side, all glass and clean lines, the kind of address that appeared in architectural publications. The penthouse was accessed by a private elevator that required a biometric key Maxim carried in a separate wallet. The space itself was sparse and carefully anonymous. Good furniture, very little of it, no personal objects that would tell a stranger anything. He handed her a clean shirt from a closet that appeared to stock emergency supplies, the way other people stocked coffee, poured 2 glasses of something aged and expensive, and sat down at a desk that held a bank of monitors, most of them showing what appeared to be financial data. He did not explain the screens. She did not ask. 2 of his guards arrived within 15 minutes, shaken but functional. A third man arrived 20 minutes after that. He introduced himself as Matthias Wren. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the groomed, contained anxiety of a man who had prepared his emotional presentation in the elevator on the way up. He was, Maxim said without inflection, his second. Matthias crossed the room and gripped Maxim's shoulder and said that thank God he was alive, that the attack had been coordinated across 3 of their downtown holdings simultaneously, that they needed to mobilize immediately and respond before dawn, or they would be perceived as weakened. His voice had exactly the right texture of urgency. His eyes, when they moved to Cleo, had something else entirely. "Who is she?" he said. "Not a question." "The reason I'm still breathing," Maxim said, and returned his attention to the monitors. Cleo sat on the edge of a white linen sofa and held her untouched glass of whiskey, and watched Matthias Wren with the same quality of attention she'd used to observe the server at the east door. Something was wrong with the shape of his anxiety. She had spent enough years in emergency medicine to know what genuine fear looked like, the actual physiological event, the specific dilation, the sweat at the temples, the breathing that couldn't quite settle. Matthias Wren was performing anxiety. It was very good. It wasn't quite right. She looked at the monitors. Maxim had pulled up what appeared to be a financial dashboard, the kind of dense ledger architecture she had spent 4 months navigating while fighting Dana's insurance denials. She'd taught herself to read billing circuits, account routing structures, the specific language of institutional money moving between entities. She had thought at the time that it was the most useless skill she would ever acquire for any purpose other than fighting her sister's case. She stood up and walked to the desk. "Mr. Sorel," she said, "can I look at something?" He looked at her. She had established, she realized, a particular kind of credit with him. She pointed to the monitor on the far right. The routing structure was elegant. She would give Matthias Wren that. It was genuinely elegant, the kind of work that would take months to find if you didn't know exactly what pattern to look for. She had learned this pattern from a hospital billing fraud case she'd followed obsessively after a colleague got caught in a similar scheme. 14 subsidiary transfers, each individually below any meaningful reporting threshold, accumulating into a transit account registered to a Delaware LLC's, with a Zurich trust as its primary shareholder. She found the number after 3 minutes of reading. $43 million. Moved across 18 months in amounts so carefully calibrated they would read as operational variance to anyone not specifically looking for extraction. She turned around. "He's lying," Cleo said. The room went very still. Matthias Wren looked at her with something that had finally dropped the performance, cold, flat, and certain. "You need to be very careful," he said softly. "Matthias," Maxim said, one word, the same way he'd said enough to the guard in the ballroom, and with the same effect. Wren went quiet. Let her finish. Cleo walked him through it, pointing at the screen, using the specific language she'd learned in the context of medical billing fraud, because it turned out that money moving illegally through institutions followed similar structural logic. Institution. She showed him the Zurich Trust. She showed him the Delaware LLC's registration date, 4 days before the first transfer. She showed him the pattern of the subsidiary accounts. "The trust's beneficial owner," she said, "is notated only by an internal reference code, but the registration attorney's firm also appears in 3 other filings under Wren's name from 2021. Matthias moved. He was fast, and he had a weapon, and he got it approximately level before Maxim crossed the room, with a speed that was completely inconsistent with the controlled stillness he'd maintained for the entire preceding hour. It was a short, efficient, total intervention. Cleo looked away at the wall and heard 2 specific sounds and did not move until it was over. When she turned back, Matthias Wren was restrained in the corner. He was alive. One of the guards had taken the weapon. Maxim was standing at the center of the room with his jacket straight and his expression entirely composed, looking at Cleo like she was a problem he was actively reordering his worldview to accommodate. "Dana," he said. Cleo blinked. "Your sister's surgery," he said. "Give me the name of her physician and her case number. It will be handled before the end of the week." She opened her mouth and closed it again. She had spent 14 months calculating and appealing, and working extra shifts and eating cheap dinners and not sleeping, and he said it the way people said they'd pick up dry cleaning. "And you," he continued, walking toward her slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone choosing their words the way a surgeon chose instruments. "You walked into my orbit with nothing but a medical assessment and the nerve to deliver it. You read a room full of career criminals in the middle of an active crisis and identified the one person in it who shouldn't have been trusted. You read his books." "I read your books," she corrected, because she couldn't help it. He just left a signature in them. Something crossed his face, a very brief, very controlled thing that was almost amusement and existed primarily in the lines around his eyes. "I have people who manage my finances," Maxim said. "I have people who manage my security. I have people who manage every operational layer of what I run." He stopped 3 feet in front of her. "I have no one who walks into the room I'm sitting in and tells me the truth about what they see." Cleo held very still. "That sounds like a job description." "It is," he said. He extended his hand to her, palm up, formal and deliberate, the same gesture she had made toward him in the hotel's freight elevator when she'd grabbed his arm in the dark and pulled him toward the exit. He was giving it back to her. She understood that. She looked at his hand. She thought about Dana, about the surgery, about $68,000 and 14 months of not sleeping. She thought about what a person became when they stepped across a line like this one, and whether it was really a step, or whether, in some fundamental way, she had been walking toward it since the moment she spotted a man across a crowded room and saw what everyone else had missed. Cleo Bancroft had spent her entire adult life in rooms where people were in crisis, making decisions that could not be undone, and being the calmest person present. She placed her hand in his.